After discovering my affair, my husband put my lover in jail and took his pension. I'm 31 years old, you can call me Gina. My husband Greg is 33 years old. We've been married for 10 years and together for almost 13 years. We have 2 children, a 9-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. Before my affair, Greg was the only man I had ever been with, and he had had 3 girlfriends before me. I had never been with anyone before him. Our marriage is very happy, full of love, laughter, and family. Although we've been married for many years, our intimacy still leaves us feeling incredibly fulfilled. Now I've screwed it all up. I met a man at my daughter's soccer practice, let's call him Rich. He has a 6-year-old daughter who plays in a League One level below my daughter's. Rich works from home, which allows him to attend soccer practices and games. At first, I was watching my kids practice and I struck up a conversation with him and the other parents. He stood out because he was one of the few dads who was there for training, which usually took place after school. As time went on, we started talking more, and I noticed that he would come over and stand near me at every training session, even when I was with the other moms. These conversations led to an awkward discussion, in which he admitted to having strong feelings for me. I made it clear that I was happily married and that we couldn't continue talking. He respected my decision and backed off, despite my rejection of his advances. I found myself enjoying the attention. I knew it was very wrong, but I wanted to be honest about how I felt. Eventually, he brought up his feelings again and asked if I would like to meet him for coffee at a cafe in a nearby town. At first I refused, but then I decided to meet him and thought it would be a one-time coffee meeting and nothing more. In retrospect, I realized that just talking to him was a deception and a total disrespect for my husband and family, but at the end of our private meeting, I couldn't seem to stop myself. Just before we left to go to the kids' practice, he suggested that I go to his house the next day, and he handed me a piece of paper with his home address on it. I initially refused, but he kissed me softly, and I was ashamed to admit that I not only kissed him back, but that we met at his house the next day and had sex when he left. We didn't talk or build up to it, we just started straight away. I felt deeply uneasy about myself when I looked around and saw pictures of his beautiful wife and children. The thought of Greg and my children overwhelmed me, and I couldn't help crying and telling Rich that I couldn't continue like this. We gathered our clothes and drove away in our own cars to attend the children's training the following week. I tried hard to avoid him at soccer practice, and I finally spoke to him again. I told him firmly that I did not want to have any contact with him anymore. In response, he handed me a note with the name and address of a hotel in a neighboring town. He said he hoped I would meet him there the next day at our usual time, but that he understood if I chose not to. I simply said no and left that night. I stayed up all night, thinking about how this could destroy my marriage and family if it ever came out. However, I foolishly thought the risk was low because we never communicated over the phone or by text, and all interactions were verbal or handwritten notes. I didn't want to go, but I eventually relented and met with him, just like we did the first time. In the end, I cried and told Rich that we couldn't keep doing this. This time he agreed, but he thought our intimate moments were worth the risk. We parted ways and didn't contact each other for a whole month, only briefly meeting at soccer practices and games. What really bothered me when I spoke to other parents was that my husband Greg and Rich had talked for over 20 minutes at one game, which made me feel really bad, but for some reason, it made me feel excited. Fast forward to my D-Day, the day my husband found out about my affair, which was the worst day of my life. The day before, Rich and I had talked during soccer practice and agreed that we shouldn't see each other anymore. Happily married, deeply in love with our spouses and children, we decided to meet for the last time, a very serious mistake. I know some people may find this hard to believe, but it's the truth. D-Day was supposed to be our last meeting. I didn't want to meet at Rich's house because I couldn't stand seeing pictures of his wife and kids, so I suggested that he come to my place. The plan was for him to park in the nearby street, walk to my house, and enter through the side door, which I told him to do because it was drizzling, there were no people in the street, and I didn't think anyone would notice. I took him to the family office on the second floor, where there was a guest bed, and that's where we met. I want to emphasize that I would never do anything on our marital bed like I did at Rich's, because I love my husband too much and respect him too much, because it would be the last time we meet. Before the actual intimate act, we had a lot of kissing and foreplay. I'm not sure what happened to Rich, but he suddenly panicked and tried to rush past Greg, who was blocking the doorway. Greg is over 6 feet tall and weighs close to 230 pounds, while Rich is about 5 feet 10 inches and only weighs about 160 pounds. As a result, Rich bounced off Greg and fell backwards to the ground. He got back up and tried to rush at Greg, but this time Greg took a step forward and pushed him back hard. The force of the push sent Rich flying backwards, where he hit a window screen and fell through the window, landing in the large bush in front of our house. This was so shocking because he was naked. I cried and begged Greg to stop, fearing he would hurt Rich and that I didn't want Greg to face legal trouble. In response, Greg looked at me with hostile eyes and went downstairs. I was worried that he might hurt Rich and worried about my husband's legal situation. I wrapped a blanket around me and looked out the window and saw Rich still lying naked in the bushes trying to get free. I could see that he had scratches on his body and was bleeding, although there didn't seem to be any serious injuries. Greg came out of the house with Rich's phone and started yelling at Rich, demanding the passcode. Rich started begging for mercy, pleading with Greg not to hurt him and not to call his wife Kate. Greg got angry and threatened Rich, saying, "Give me the damn passcode or there'll be consequences." Rich quickly provided the passcode, which Greg entered into the phone. Greg then called Kate, introduced himself and explained the situation. He told her that he was standing there with her husband and that he had just caught him in an intimate act with his wife. After some discussion and reassurances, he gave Kate our address and ended the call. Noticing that our next-door neighbor had come over, he asked Greg if everything was okay. Greg replied that it was not normal, but that he could handle it. Greg thanked him for bringing the situation to his attention and explained that he had walked in on us while we were having sex. Our neighbor mentioned that he had suspected something was wrong when he saw a man loitering outside our house. At first, he thought that a burglary might have occurred until he saw me open the door and let the man in. The neighbor felt compelled to call Greg. Greg told the neighbor that he intended to contact the police to report the incident. When he heard this, Richie started crying and begged Greg not to call the police. At that time, Richie was still not dressed and was shaking all over. I called Greg and begged him not to call the police, but he ignored me and called the police anyway. The police arrived within a few minutes. Greg and our neighbor met the police officer on the roadside and discussed for a few minutes. They pointed at our neighbor's house, then at our office window, then walked into the bushes where Rich was huddled, still naked, crying. The officer asked Greg if he could get Rich's clothes back, and Greg agreed. When I heard Greg open the door, I ran up the stairs, crying, to express my apologies and love. However, he did not look up, just picked up Rich's clothes and shoes from the floor and stairs and went back outside. The officer took the clothes from Greg and handed them to Rich, who dressed clumsily. Rich was breathing heavily and his body was still shaking violently. I had never seen anyone in that state before, and I realized that it was probably due to a combination of tension, fear, shock and the cold, as the temperature outside was about 55 degrees. I stood by the window while the officers questioned Rich, but they could not see me because of the window screen. The officers told Rich to calm down and relax, which he eventually did. Rich took responsibility for what had happened, admitting that it was all his fault. He gave a truthful account of what had happened and explained that he had rushed at Greg because he just wanted to get out of there. The officers asked Greg if he had acted in self-defense or aggression when he pushed Rich, and Rich answered that it was self-defense. I was relieved that Rich had not falsely accused Greg. Soon after, a group of neighbors gathered at our front door, reminding Greg that his neighbors were explaining the situation to them. I felt so embarrassed that I couldn't stop crying and went back to the police officer and Rich. The police officer asked Rich if he wanted to press charges, but Rich refused, saying he wanted to leave and promised not to disturb our family again. Rich's wife Kate came to our front door shortly after, and my husband went out to greet her. They had a brief conversation. Rich rushed over to apologize to her, but she ignored him. The officer spoke to Kate, and I heard her vaguely say she wanted Rich to stay away from her. Then the officer told Rich to step back, which he did, and he started crying uncontrollably. The officer spoke to Greg and Kate for a few minutes, then came inside to speak to me. He called upstairs to ask if I could come downstairs and talk to him, which I agreed to, but asked for a minute to get dressed. Then the officer took my statement, and towards the end of the conversation, he mentioned that my husband had asked me to leave the house voluntarily. I told the officer that I didn't want to leave and that I needed to talk to my husband. The officer understood how I felt, but explained that I would be better off leaving for at least one night to let things calm down. I broke down in tears and the officer asked if I could call someone. I told him it was okay and my parents called almost immediately. I heard my mom talking to Greg on the porch. When I saw her expression, I simply said, "Mom, I'm sorry, I messed up, really messed up." The officer then explained to my mom that I'd be better off staying with her for a few days until things calmed down. My mom and I went upstairs to pack, and she didn't say anything while I was doing it, but I could tell she was upset, embarrassed and deeply disappointed in me. When my mom and I went downstairs and out into the street, only the officer and a few neighbors were still chatting on the sidewalk. The officer told us that Greg had gone to pick up the kids from school, take them to practice, and then have dinner together. He mentioned that Greg had asked me to close and lock up, and that Greg would be in touch in a few days. When we got back to my parents' house, both my mom and dad scolded me for ruining my marriage. I just apologized and expressed my determination to regain Greg's trust. However, my dad told me that it was unlikely to happen and that I should start preparing for divorce. This news brought tears to my eyes, and my mother asked him why he was saying such things. He replied that it was because it was true. Over the next 2 days, I repeatedly texted and called Greg, but he didn't respond. Then, on Wednesday night, he texted that we would meet at our house on Saturday morning to discuss the next steps. In the same text, he mentioned that he had already spoken to our children about what had happened. I couldn't believe that he had done this behind my back. I was afraid that our children might now despise me. In another text message, Greg told me in another text message that he had sued the rich man and obtained a 30-day restraining order. I hated hearing this because I just wanted this nightmare to end. To make matters worse, the police section of the local newspaper reported the incident, without mentioning names or our street number, but did reveal the name of our street and clearly described what had happened on Saturday. I felt both excited and nervous when I saw Greg again. My parents drove me home and waited on the porch while Greg and I met inside. I told them they could go, but Greg insisted they stay because he wasn't comfortable being alone with me. When I leaned in for a hug, he held his hand up to keep his distance. We sat down and he handed me the separation agreement. I broke down and begged him not to do this. I continued to plead, expressing how sad I was and how much I loved him and only him, yet he firmly refused and began to explain the contents of the divorce papers. Despite my constant pleading, he continued to explain the details of the divorce, mentioning that I could move back into the house but that I would live in the office, which would remain as it was when I left. He then spoke about splitting our bank accounts and dividing the title to the house in case it was sold, but stressed that he wanted me to waive any claim to his 401k retirement account. 01k retirement account. He then explained that starting the following month, would be responsible for 35% of our living expenses, including mortgage insurance, utilities, car payments, groceries, etc. Given that I am not working, I would need to pay him this money as my share of the savings he has earned for me. He made it clear that all these terms were written in the separation agreement and suggested that I consult a lawyer to review the agreement. I expressed reluctance to a lawyer and reiterated my wish to talk to him about our relationship, but he calmly but firmly stated that there was nothing more to talk about and that he just wanted to formally separate from me. He also clarified that he would only communicate with me in matters involving the children or when our children were present during the conversation. I asked him through tears if he planned to divorce me, and he replied that that was exactly what he planned to do. I told him that I couldn't imagine life without him and that I was willing to do whatever it took to save our relationship, but he just stared at me with disgust and then burst out laughing. Then he called my parents into the room and used the speakerphone to explain to both sets of parents everything he had just told me. It felt like a business meeting, but it was torture for me. All I could do was apologize to Greg. This all happened earlier today and now I find myself at my office writing this article because I couldn't sleep after chatting with my sister who gave me some valuable advice and suggested that I post it here to see if any of my readers can offer any other helpful advice, so I'm here seeking guidance on what I should do. Have I irrevocably destroyed my marriage? Is there any hope of salvaging the good life I've destroyed or have I lost it forever? I welcome all responses, even critical ones. Right now I feel like a complete mess, with no one to turn to. My sister has been supportive, even though she too is disgusted by my actions. Thank you in advance for taking the time to read my post and for any responses you may have. Since my last update, a lot has happened in my life. First, I would like to thank all of you who responded to my original post. Reading all of the responses has provided me with some measure of comfort, even though many of them were harshly critical of my actions. From my experience, I can attest that not every story has a happy ending, and in fact some endings are truly heartbreaking. Greg and I are now officially divorced, and just writing those words makes me well up with tears. I still can't fully come to terms with the reality of it all, and it feels like a never-ending nightmare. If you remember my initial post, my husband and I were living together, even though we were legally separated at the beginning. Our relationship was cold and distant, but in the first month, Greg gradually began to warm up. He started talking to me more, and even shared laughter and jokes with me and the kids. I felt optimistic about our progress and believed that if we continued down this path, we could reconcile. However, unexpectedly, 4 months after our separation, Greg expressed a desire to speak to me privately without the children. I thought it might be a discussion about how to take the next steps towards reconciliation, but to my shock, he told me he wanted a divorce. I completely fell apart. I know the word "fall apart" is used a lot in these posts, but I can assure you, I really felt it. Greg explained that while he had always loved me deeply and seen me as the mother of our 2 beautiful children, the love, passion and trust he once felt for me was gone. I tried everything I could to change his mind, but his decision was final. We embraced, but it didn't feel like a husband and wife embrace, more like a hug between 2 friends. We had been separated for almost 4 months and had already reached an agreement on property division and custody issues in our separation agreement. The divorce process went quickly and was finalized in February of this year. Greg was very fair to me. He bought my share of the family home and even gave me $10,000 to ensure I could provide a stable home for the kids. Although I had a substantial sum of money after the divorce, it wasn't enough to buy a house or support me for the rest of my life, so I ended up getting a job with a new donut chain conveniently located across the street from our kids' school. I knew the franchise owner, so I asked her about a job, and she hired me on the spot. You might think I really like working there. The owner is very kind and understanding, my coworkers are great, and our customers are very friendly. Sometimes I wish I had taken the job when I got married, maybe things wouldn't have turned out like this. You know the proverb, idle hands are the devil's playground, or something. Well, I can't change the past, and you might think I loved working there. The owner was very friendly and understanding, the colleagues were great, and the customers super friendly. I kind of wish I'd found a job when I got married, because maybe things wouldn't have turned out like they did. You know the proverb, idle hands are the devil's playground, or something like that. Oh well, I can't change the past. Apparently, Greg and Kate had been seeing each other during our separation. Rumor has it that they started dating shortly after D-Day, but since we live in a no-fault marriage system, it doesn't really matter. Unlike Greg and I, Kate decided to divorce Rich immediately. Their divorce was finalized a few months before ours, mainly because the house they were living in was a gift to her and they didn't have much in the way of savings. As for Rich, his story is sad, and the divorce has affected him greatly. Last Halloween, he was arrested for driving under the influence, apparently his second offense. Kate used this to gain full custody of their daughter, and Rich now only has supervised visitation rights, which take place at Kate's parents' house because Greg and Kate don't want to see him and Rich is afraid of Greg. I learned all this through gossip. I don't think Kate's actions towards the father of her child are fair or kind, even though she may have strong negative feelings towards him. However, I understand her motives. Kate and her daughter currently live with Greg and my child in the former my house, which technically no longer belongs to me, but I still think of it as such. The whole situation is really frustrating, and I try not to dwell on it, even though it keeps nagging at the back of my mind. I try to convince myself that what Kate is going through is just a transitional phase for Greg, like the one I went through with Rich. Kate is young and attractive, she is 26, so she is like Greg's new love, Greg. I doubt that their love is genuine, considering the stressful circumstances under which they met. Despite this, I remain hopeful that Greg and I will eventually reconcile. In the meantime, I sincerely wish him and Kate all the best. Recently, I received news that my contact with Greg will be further restricted. He informed me that as of this Wednesday, we can only communicate about the children via email. Greg mentioned that Kate has been communicating with Rich in the same way and that he would like to do the same. Hearing this news was another blow to me. I believe Kate must have influenced this decision, because Greg would not have cut me off like this alone. For my part, I have been spending most of my time decorating my new apartment to make it a comfortable space for the kids. It only has 2 bedrooms, so things are a bit tight, but we are working on it. I wish I could go back in time and change it, but that's impossible, so I focus on moving forward one step at a time. This is where I am at the moment. Thank you for taking the time to read this, it's been quite an interesting story. Now let's move on to another exciting story, so stay tuned and let's go deeper. I met my wife when I was 16, but we didn't get married until we were 21. We had our daughter when we were 22, and now we're both 47. The day I found out she was unfaithful was pretty unusual. I woke up that morning feeling under the weather, and I almost considered calling in sick to work, but I went in anyway, even though I left early afterwards. In retrospect, I'm glad I left early that day, because my wife also works. I couldn't help wondering if I'd eaten something bad the night before or if I was just coming down with something. Incidentally, she's an excellent cook, which is probably the only thing she's good at. Now that I think about it, I completely ignored an important warning sign: her best friend Kay. Kay happens to be single and frequently changes partners. She would share her infidelities with my wife, who asserted that she could never live that way. She expressed her happiness through marriage and family life. Ironically, her best friend Kai even had an affair with her wife's college boyfriend, but this was her closest friend. The company you keep says a lot. I didn't really know my wife until I discovered her infidelity. That morning, I felt unwell, so after drinking some coffee, I went to work. I felt a little better, but the bouts continued. I finished work at noon and stopped to buy some medicine before going home, hoping it would help me sleep and get rid of the discomfort. My wife was also supposed to be at work that morning. She got ready for work as usual, and I usually left the house for work before her, but she got ready as if she were going to the office. As I drove into our building, it is worth noting that we rent a townhouse and share a wall with another house. I had to take a detour around the parking lot and found my wife's car parked in the neighbor's space. I thought he might have a guest, but then I thought, why is his car gone and why can't my wife's car find a parking space here? I decided to park in the street in front of the building. As I approached the entrance, I heard deafening music. At first I thought it might be the neighbor, but soon realized that the sound was coming from our unit. You can see our bedroom window from the front of the unit, and the music must have come from there. As soon as I entered the door, my guess was confirmed. The music was playing in our house. I hurried up the stairs, opened the bedroom door and found my wife in physical contact with a man, who I later found out was her boss, while her best friend was hugging the man and the music was blaring. I shouted at her what was going on and my wife quickly got off the man, her boss, and begged me to calm down. "Call me darling, please don't be angry." I pushed my wife away and started a physical confrontation with the man together with her best friend. I received a punch in the nose that did not break the bone, but I needed medical treatment. I tried to sue her and her boss for their involvement in the conflict between my wife and me. This is another complicated story that differs greatly from the simple advice on the internet. My wife and her friend started arguing and the scene became chaotic. Looking back, I still can't believe the absurd situation at the time. I turned off the music and ordered the man to leave my house. He left in a hurry, without even getting dressed. However, when I went to the other room to check the window, he had already pulled up his trousers and was hurrying downstairs to his car, back to the room where my wife and her friend were arguing. Her friend urged my wife to confess and tell me the truth, but my wife remained silent, staring at her friend, who eventually revealed that this was their way of life and that my wife had joined her 3 years ago, when I had lost my job and my wife had kept hers. During that time, I received unemployment benefits, but losing that important part of our income was a very serious challenge for us. She mentioned that my wife had sought financial help from her and suggested that my wife could join her in her work. I asked the nature of the occupation, but she implied I already knew. I insisted I didn't and had never really paid attention, except to notice she was often with different men, and whenever I saw her she clarified that the men provided her with services mainly dating and conversation. I interrupted her and asked, "So an S-worker?" She just stared at me. I turned to look at my wife, but she kept her head down. I then left the house and drove to a nearby family where I revealed everything: divorce plans, STD testing and a paternity test. With the support of a close family member, I found a divorce lawyer who helped me pay the initial fees, even though I later gave him the money back despite his assurances that I didn't need to worry. I went to the doctor and had the tests done, and everything came back normal. The paternity test also confirmed that my beautiful daughter is indeed mine. I tried to sue for the concept of distancing of affection until my lawyer mentioned it, and I didn't know it existed. Her boss disputed the claim, claiming that he was not responsible for our marital problems. My wife sided with him, claiming that our marriage had already deteriorated before she started seeing him. Long story short, the lawsuit was dropped, and due to our financial constraints, I was unable to sue him, and my priority became the divorce, which became my main priority. As a result, both my ex-wife and her boss were fired. I suspect that my ex-wife may continue to work for, but it seems that no one wants to provide services for her. It seems that she may now want her husband back. It was not the first time that she expressed her longing for me at our daughter's wedding. Previously, when our family was together planning something for our daughter, my ex-wife suddenly said, "Oh my goodness, I remember our honeymoon. We stayed in a hotel near the concert, and it was so much fun." I deliberately didn't respond to her statements, hoping to avoid the subject, but she continued, "We were so happy once, but I went and ruined it all." I continued to ignore her, and soon her tears flowed. My daughter just observed her mother and asked what was bothering her. My ex-wife admitted that she had ruined her life and felt like she had nothing. She expressed her desire to communicate, but felt like no one was listening to her. She begged her daughter to promise that she would do everything to preserve her family and not repeat her mistakes. I tried to hold back my laughter, but I couldn't help it, and both my daughter and ex-wife turned to look at me. I quickly made an excuse to go to the bathroom, where I couldn't stop laughing. I couldn't believe this woman. I gathered myself together, looked in the mirror and even laughed a little to myself. I returned to the main room where we continued to discuss plans for my daughter's wedding day. My ex-wife told me she missed me, and that attending my daughter's wedding had brought back memories of the love and family we once shared. She expressed regret for the actions that had caused our family to break apart, and hoped that one day I would be able to forgive her. She tried to cry on my shoulder, but I gently pushed her away, telling her not to get my suit dirty. Then I went back inside to celebrate my daughter's special day. My daughter wanted a photo of the two of us, so I obliged. To be honest, I can't stand being around this woman, but she always seems to find a way to get close to me. I try to interact with other people and make sure everyone is fine, but when I turn around, she's right behind me. I politely ask her to leave, and she grabs my shoulder and pleads with me to listen to her. My daughter's little cousins are watching us, and I can tell they're embarrassed for their aunt, just like I would be. Eventually we go back outside, and I yell at her, "What do you need?" She told me that she had to have surgery to treat a reproductive problem, some kind of cyst. She assured me that she would be fine. She said she felt lonely and asked if I could take care of her for the week she was home recovering, because our daughter would be out of the country that month. I expressed sympathy for her situation and wished her well, but made it clear that I could not take care of her. She started crying again and clung to me, but I gently broke free. She asked, "You won't take care of the mother of your child, the person you once loved?" I answered, "No." Then I asked about her best friend Kai, and she told me that Kai had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital because of medication problems that had caused confusion in her brain. She seems to be facing a lot of problems right now, and even tried to hurt a family member who tried to support her. I briefly responded with an "oh," turned around and went inside. Just after my ex-wife left, I found her talking to our daughter, wiping tears from her face. But that wasn't the end. She had successfully convinced our daughter that I was a horrible person for not helping her during the week of her surgery. Our daughter was angry and upset, thinking that she might have to cancel her trip and lose the money she had already spent on it. I have no intention of taking care of that woman. She should arrange for professional care or something similar. It is not my responsibility. I am not at all surprised by my ex-wife's friend Kay and the medication she is taking. I remember having told my ex-wife before that I suspected Kay was taking some kind of medication, and I was serious. She always behaves in an exaggerated manner and sometimes seems very nervous, but my ex-wife insists that this is just her usual behavior. No, I think she may have a history of taking medication and she may have accidentally taken medication laced with harmful ingredients. She called me crying and said I was being too hard on her mother. She understood what her mother had done to me, but she thought I should continue to take care of her because it was the right thing to do. I told her that would not happen, that I would not take care of her mother, that she had other family members who should take care of her and that it was not my responsibility. I made it clear that I did not want anything to do with her mother. I tried to talk to my daughter, but she seemed unable to understand. Nevertheless, my daughter did not cancel the trip and she went ahead. My ex-wife made one last attempt to get me to help her and called in tears. I got a call from her sister and spoke to her briefly. She said that I represent my sister, your ex-wife, and that she wants to talk to you. I refused and explained that I know what is going on and I don't want to hear from her. Her sister then said that there is no one else who can help, that the operation needs to be done urgently, and she even offered to pay me to do the operation, but I firmly refused, saying that there is not enough money in the world to make me help. I told her to stop calling me, that I am an ex-wife, and then picked up the phone and told me not to be so stubborn and do what I should do. I took the phone away from my face and stared at it. I wondered what I should do. I wondered if she was joking. I put the phone back to my ear and asked her what she meant. She replied, "Yes, we are divorced, but we were once married, and we were once in love. Love doesn't just disappear. How can you have so much love for me when you don't feel anything for me? You love our daughter, but you don't love me. It doesn't make sense." In response, I wished her well with her operation and hung up. After that, I blocked her sister's phone number and all her family's numbers, because I didn't want anyone texting or calling me, pleading with me to take care of her. If she hadn't betrayed me and was still my wife, I would have done anything for her, but considering the way she hurt me could endanger my health and break up my family, you tell me, helping her is my responsibility as an ex-husband. To be honest, if an ex-husband goes out of his way to help an ex-wife who has hurt him, there must be something seriously wrong with them and they should seek help. This makes no sense to me, just like her best friend Kay, who was admitted to a psychiatric hospital for similar problems. I have no news of my ex-wife and I don't know how her operation went. To be honest, I don't hope she'll be fine, but I hope her operation will go well. I'm not the kind of person who will be persuaded to take care of her and help her get back on her feet, only to be abused again.